Travillian Next is a division of Travillian, a financial services specialist search and talent advisory firm. Since inception, the Travillian team has dedicated itself to enhancing the return on investment of a company's most important resource, its people.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Travillian Next podcast. I'm really excited to have an old colleague and friend of mine join today, Brian Gardner, head of policy at Stifel. Brian, thanks for joining us today. I know it's a busy time of year for you, so appreciate you taking time out of your schedule.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for the invitation. Busy time of the cycle, not just the year. I mean, this is the 4-year presidential cycle.
That's right.
It's on steroids this time.
That's right. So we'll get into it. But first, I'd love if you could just give the audience a quick intro of your background and kind of how you got to Stifel. And then I got a bunch of questions to try and hit on and a lot to talk about.
Sure. So former Capitol Hill staffer a long time ago, worked for 2 members of the House Financial Services Committee. Then joined a law firm up in New York and did bank regulatory law in their practice group there. Representing mostly international banks and their acquisitions here in the United States, in general bank regulatory work for them here in the United States. Then I did a career change and I joined KBW back in 2002 as part of the rebuild from 9/11, and thought I was going to be a fundamental analyst, but events got in the way and transitioned to a policy role a couple of years into my gig at KBW, and then in 2000, when we were undergoing COVID and that upcoming presidential election, I transitioned over to the Stifel side, pretty much doing the same work that I had been doing at KBW for all those years, but just kind of broadening my perspective and the sectors that I would opine on.
That's great. So it's been an interesting summer. What do you kind of make of the twists and turns of the presidential election? You have the first Biden-Trump debate, then you have Harris taking the top spot on the ticket, you have the Trump assassination attempt, and then, the Harris-Trump debate that just completed. It's probably one of the wilder 3 months I can remember in a presidential cycle, but, I'd love your take, and I imagine you feel similarly, but.
And assassination attempt number 2 yesterday,
That's true.
I mean, so let me answer it in a slightly different way, because I think this helps investors and observers understand how the race is evolving. And I think this is important. All those things that you went through, and there are other things that you didn't include on the list, but that you would think would be transformative of a presidential race, generally have not been. For 2 reasons. One is that the news cycle is very short. The news cycle has a very short lifespan. And so, Donald Trump was convicted in a New York court back in June, and everybody thought is a game changer. And it's really, and within a week, 2 weeks, pretty much no one was talking about it. Then Donald Trump gets shot. Well, the debate last week, that didn't even come up in the conversation, not as questions, maybe it got referenced in passing. But the fact that the candidate of one of the 2 major parties was shot at a campaign stop and doesn't get mentioned in debate, and the reason I think is it's kind of exited our consciousness a little bit. So the news cycle is very, very short. And this goes kind of then to the debate of last week, what it all means, what the lasting effect is. So I think when you're trying to figure out where the race is and where the race is going, be very careful about taking a specific event in its immediate aftermath and saying, this is it. This is going to change the race one way or the other, because in another week, we're probably going to be talking about something else. And that seminal event, something you thought was a seminal event, wasn't so much.
No, I think it's, hearing you say that out loud, it really is the truth. I mean, it just, we bounce around like in a pinball machine, and it's really been more true than not for the last few months here. Now, you mentioned the debate last week, the impossible question. Post that debate, they've said there's not going to be a third debate now, where it seems pretty tight, but do you have any thoughts or views about where the race kind of stands at this point in the cycle, whether it's through surveys or DC contacts or anything?
Yeah, so I mean, DC contacts, they're relying mostly on polling that the rest of us are. They have no great insights compared to the rest of the country. They're really good at understanding the workings of Washington, but all this is going on outside of Washington, especially in the key battleground states. So I don't think Washington doesn't have some great unique insight into the race. And so the debate and kind of where we are, where we're going. So it's a tight race. It really is close to a coin flip. So if we back up for a second, we have Harris getting in the race when President Biden dropped out. And then she has this enjoys this surge of enthusiasm, and her poll numbers go up, especially when compared to Biden. She probably has taken a very small lead nationally over Trump. The debate probably solidified that a little bit, maybe expanded it a little bit. We haven't gotten a lot of polling since post-debate polling, so we don't know. But this goes back to my point in the previous question, the lifespan of the news cycle. What's going to be the impact of the debate longer term? And even though, in my opinion, Kamala Harris won the debate, Donald Trump lost the debate. It wasn't a good night for him. I'm not convinced that there is a lasting impact on the race, because I think the country is just so divided, and the race is so close. I don't see how. I'm skeptical that night had a big impact longer term. And then just in terms of looking at the race itself and the polling, and polling's not perfect, but it's helpful. It shows trends. It's not necessarily predictive, because it's not. Polling can't really accurately show how election night's going to pan out this far out, but it shows us where the race has been and where it's heading. So it has value, and you can also compare it to this point in past cycles. And so what I'm seeing is that Harris probably has a very small lead over Donald Trump, but it's not a lead that any Democrat or the Harris campaign should feel comfortable about, because Donald Trump basically is outperforming where he was in the past two elections. So if you look at this date in 2020, this date in 2016, Trump is doing better against Harris at this point than he did either against Clinton or Biden. There are other metrics where Harris is not performing at the level that Clinton and Biden did at this point. And then you just look overall on the Trump kind of ingrained advantage in the Electoral College, and how polls have kind of missed his performance, especially in the industrial states. CNN did some work a couple of months ago, basically showed that at election day, at the end of the cycle, polls had underestimated Donald Trump showing on an average in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, those three states, by an average of 9 points against Joe Biden and about 5 points against Hillary Clinton. So if you look at the polls today and say, Kamala Harris is up in those states, but she's only up by a point, maybe 2 points. And on a historical comp, it's not a great look right now for her.
That's helpful context. I mean, obviously, it's a difficult question to answer, but it's been pretty close the last couple cycles, so I wouldn't expect it any different. It's probably only a few states either way that
the country's very split. I mean, yeah. So let me just make two observations on that. Going back to the winter when Joe Biden was still in the race, Wall Street Journal did a poll and basically found that 48% of the country was committed to voting against Donald Trump. 47% of the country was committed to voting against Joe Biden. So it just shows you that dynamic. There's only 5% of the country at that point. It's probably grown a little bit more with Harris getting in the race, but it's a very small sliver that has not decided how they're going to vote. And the other is I go back. I think this is a historic comp on the United States Senate, because I think it just shows the trend to not split tickets anymore, and how divided, so many voters, so many citizens are in one camp or the other. They don't go back and forth. So if you go back to 2000, George W. Bush wins the 2000 election. He beats Al Gore. If you look at the composition of the Senate right after that election in the winter of 2001, there were over 20, I think it was like 25, maybe even 30 senators that represented states where they had split, where they represented a state. They were a Democratic senator that represented a state that voted for Bush. They were a Republican senator that their state voted for Gore. That's a pretty healthy number. After Biden won in 2020, that number is down to 6. After the midterms, we're down to 5. I can come up with a scenario going through this next election where we're probably going to be down to 3 or 4. The country is very, very split.
It feels that way based on, the interactions you have yourself with everyday people. I mean, I don't think it's a stretch. I wanted to transition a little, get a little bit more focused on the bank industry for a second here. I think we just had a conference recently, and I think as an industry, people generally view a Trump win as their best kind of outcome for pro-economic growth, pro-bank regulation. Trump's interesting, though, because he definitely has a little thesis drift in his lifetime. I think specifically, what do you think a Trump victory brings that will help the bank industry? Is it really just a perception? Is it just as simple as perception and lower corporate tax rates, or does it go deeper than that? I just would love your thoughts, and especially since we've seen him come in and come out, right? I think we can get a little bit of an idea of the differences.
No, if we compare it back to 2016, I mean, clearly the tax issue was a driving issue. And that was big because for the banking industry generally, because prior to the 2017 tax law, banks generally paid a higher effective rate than a lot of other sectors. So the industry really benefited from the cut in the corporate tax rate. And that was a big boost and cannot be ignored. He has talked about cutting further the corporate tax rate. I'm a little skeptical that that's going to get through Congress next year. What's probably going to be a very split Congress facing large budget deficits and fiscal challenges. So cutting the corporate rates going further is going to be tougher. Then you have the regulatory side. And I think the industry benefited. Especially the larger regional banks. I think kind of the right sizing or the tailoring of some of the Dodd-Frank rules that have been retailored since. But I think that tailoring, and kind of a lighter touch on community banks, I think was generally beneficial for the industry. And I think we'll probably see that again. So when I talk about a Trump 2.0 administration, I do think it's going to be more populist, which is not necessarily pro-business. But I think that populist fervor is going to be more evident in agencies other than the bank regulatory agencies. So I'm thinking about law enforcement, justice issues, the border, national defense. So DOJ, Department of Defense, Homeland Security related agencies. I think you'll get a more populist type of leader at those agencies. What we saw in Trump 1.0 was kind of mostly mainstream Republicans. It was a pretty traditional Republican approach to regulation. I think the industry likes that, and I think the industry probably gets something similar to that this time around, even though other agencies may not see the same type of person leading those government agencies.
When you think about the pool of candidates on both sides of the ticket for some of the key bank regulatory agencies, I'm sure we could sit here and riff on it all day, but anything really kind of that stands out as someone that would be either very good or very bad, or maybe someone unexpected that people should start wrapping their head around, pro or con? I love any insights.
I think we have a general idea of what the profile of a Trump appointee will look like. Somebody with a business background, somebody who's kind of steeped in the industry, and I think it's generally a positive for the industry. Even if we don't have specific names, because I think some of the folks that served in Trump point one, they've gone on to other things. They're not going to go back to a second Trump administration. I think that general profile being pro-growth, lighter regulatory touch that's informed more by industry experience and not just an academic perspective. Academic perspective is important. It's important to research these issues, but a practitioner who puts them into practice, who actually manages a bank and knows beyond what goes on in the classroom and knows what it means to manage a bank and its balance sheet, that's a different skill set. So I think that's the type of person you get with a second Trump administration. Harris is a little bit tougher to figure out. One, she doesn't have a background in banking regulation. She was the Attorney General in California and was involved in the foreclosure settlement agreements in California. So she has some history with the industry. But she's had a lot of staff turnover as vice president early in this administration. So we don't know who's going to go back after kind of having a bit of a fallout. She has shifted positions. It's been well documented what she ran on in 2019 when she was seeking the Democratic nomination for president, how she has now abandoned a number of those positions. And what does she go back to? You do get down to this question of who is Kamala Harris and what is her, what's her philosophy on banking regulation. I don't think there are easy answers. I think there are a number of progressive type of appointees who she could lean on and probably will lean on. I think the big question also to see is there's an office in the White House called the Office of Personnel Management. And I'd be very interested to see who gets that position, because that's the gatekeeper for so many of these key positions throughout an administration. And I think progressives were very successful in the Biden administration by having somebody at OPM that led to a number of progressive appointments in the Biden administration. I don't know that Harris goes that route or not, but these are questions that are not easily answerable at this point.
No, it's interesting context though, and on that academic versus kind of practitioner point that you made, to get a little micro for a second, there's been a lot of chatter in my universe, and especially in the community banking as a service world, about this FDIC proposal around brokered deposits, and I think this nestles into that construct that you built out so well, right? Because academically, sure, I mean, heavy amounts of brokered deposits probably isn't fantastic for a regulated banking institution, but in practice, like even if you look at the First Republics of the world and which deposits actually left the bank that led to their issues, they weren't brokered deposits, they were everyday people deposits, right? So
I'm sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead.
This is a point, you're getting at a point that FDIC Vice Chairman Travis Hill made in a speech last year. I was thinking probably right about a year ago, September of last year, kind of the fallout of Silicon Valley and the other bank failures. And this predates the proposal on that the FDIC put out on broker deposits. But he made the observation that contrary to conventional wisdom, it was broker deposits that were probably stickier than other deposits. And I thought it was a very interesting comment, and he did some analysis in that speech to lay out the data. So yeah, I think the FDIC obviously went in a different direction under Chairman Gruenberg, kind of rolling back the rules back to 2020. But there certainly are voices within the FDIC saying, we need to look at, the agency needs to look at this more closely, because, not everything is as it appears to be.
And I guess just a simple follow-up, and because we could talk about this proposal till we're blue in the face, but that's probably a different podcast. But how much political posturing is in a proposal like this? Like, I imagine there are some things that are key, but there's some other things that are in there more sacrificial lambs to get those key things. Do you think that's a fair view? I mean, we don't necessarily know which are fall in which bucket, but like, what's your experience and thoughts with that?
No, I mean, every proposal is going to have kind of an ideological bent to it, and an ideological goal. And so there is probably some of that. Bank regulations can be hyper technical, and this is pretty technical, but it does seem like it has the goal of just rolling back and kind of going back to a previous regime that had been worked on for a long time. And that 2020 proposal didn't come out of thin air. The previous administration it was run by Yelena McWilliams. They'd put in a lot of time and effort into looking at broker deposits. The industry has been looking at it, but this does have a feel to it. I'm just kind of going on a hunch here that it's just kind of a blowback against the industry. And I'll be interested to read the comments that are submitted. I think they're going to be very technical with a lot of data about possible flaws in the proposal.
Yeah. Well, Brian, this has been great. I wanted to wrap up kind of on a constructive note here. I think one thing I've noticed over the years is, bank industry lobbying efforts sometimes don't feel as successful as they can be. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in terms of, or any anecdotes you're willing to share about how the industry can perhaps be a little bit more effective. The analogy I always use is like, you see how effective the crypto industry is, and they don't even really do anything, but they're still impacting things. Banks have been around forever and are like a key part of our entire capitalistic economy here. And I just would love any kind of insights or like I said, stories or just some of your personal views about what can be done differently or better.
Yeah, I mean, I think the banking industry is an effective lobby. It's in a difficult position because the country's never loved bankers. This goes back to the founding of the country, where kind of the heartland in the middle of the country would be suspicious of moneyed interests on the coasts. This is kind of the populist fervor that has its its origins back in our founding. So it's nothing new. I think community bankers are effective because they're in close contact with their local members of Congress and their senators. So I think there's a lot of success there. And they're not, they don't have the baggage that maybe some large banks do. And large banks, they're not viewed in the same light as they were immediately in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But the country is never going to love Wall Street banks, ever. So I think you have to keep in that context. You also have to, it's a diverse industry, so it doesn't always speak with one voice, which is difficult. A divided industry is not an effective lobbying organization. Generally up on Capitol Hill, you need a unified voice to get things done. But I think, we can take a couple of lessons away from the work on Basel III and the Basel III Endgame proposal, which is telling the story. And this is always about storytelling, right? But what the impact of proposals are going to be. And I think the broker deposit proposal is going down this road as well, which is telling the story through the lens of the end user, of the customer, because that's ultimately one of the parties that gets impacted and kind of has been overlooked a lot in past regulatory efforts. So I think the industry has successfully focused more on the end user, and I think that's led to some victories, with Basel III Endgame probably getting reproposed. We'll see what it does on the broker deposit rule. I just, especially for community bankers, if you're not engaged, I would be. I mean, I understand that people don't like politics, and especially if your local member of Congress does not share your political beliefs or is of a different political party, it can be difficult. I will also say that I think at the end of the day, it's worth the effort to go in and not just once or twice, but repeatedly meet with the member to tell your story. Because I do think, especially at the community bank level, there's a good story to be told. Members of Congress are very interested in hearing your perspective. And while the trade associations that represent the industry in Washington, whether it's the American Bankers Association, the Independent Community Bankers, it's still, they're very good at what they do. But I think their leadership would tell their members and non-members, if you're not in one of those organizations, that you, the CEO, the CFO, senior management, need to be engaged with your local member of Congress. You're the best lobbyist there is.
That's a good positive note to end on, Brian. Really appreciate you joining us. Busy time for you, and we unpacked a lot in there. But good luck between now and the election, and hopefully we get a chance to speak more soon.
Michael, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be with you.